Welcome, everybody, to the Just Berry podcast. Today's guest is going to be super powerful. You're going to learn a lot today. We've got Court McGee. He is a professional UFC fighter and the winner of the Ultimate Fighter Season 11. Beyond his achievements in the octagon, Court's life is a powerful testament to resilience, faith, and transformation. He once was battling severe drug addiction and survived an overdose that left him clinically dead for 8 minutes. He's since embraced recovery and dedicated himself to inspiring others. Now over 15 years sober, Court shares his story of redemption through platforms like the McGee Project, where he advocates for mental health, addiction recovery, and positive decision making. A devoted husband and father, Court blends his roles as a fighter, mentor, and advocate to inspire hope, encourage, and overcoming adversity. Welcome, Court.
Nice. Great intro.
Thank you. With a little help of ChatGPT, you can have a bio too.
Yeah.
I know all those things from the time that I spent training at Adagima with you, so I want to talk about that briefly. I think I met you in the beginning of when I kind of started training, and I knew you're a UFC fighter, and you're a really amazing coach. I love how you teach. But when I found out more about your background and the adversity that you have overcome in your personal life and just how you're open about that, I just looked up to you so much more. I really respect that and just appreciate how you are open about the adversity that you've overcome. So I wanted to dive a little bit more into that today.
Okay. Yeah. Pretty early on, I decided I was going to be open with it. I don't know. I grew up in a wonderful family. Well, where do you want me to start?
We can start from the beginning and just see where it goes.
Okay. So as far as being a martial artist or a UFC fighter now, I had some cousins about the same age as me. One was 4 or 5 years older. I have one older brother. So there was 3 of us, and at 6 years old, I got left in an amusement park by my aunt and uncle with my cousins, and they were a little bit more well-traveled than me and my older brother, and I got separated from the group for hours and hours and hours, and they had to send out a search party, and they found me, and I went and hid in between these garbage cans at this hot dog stand. And I mean, it was super hot, middle of the summer. I got heat stroke. I had a little bit of separation anxiety. Still to this day, the smell of ketchup, mayo, and mustard, I don't have any condiments. And it's so I had some issues. And then, right around that age is when you start, preschool, first grade. And I was scared to death to go to school. All of a sudden, I was scared to death of the dark. I would sneak out of my room in the middle of the night and go sleep with my parents. And I hadn't slept with them since I was a little tiny baby. And so my parents put me in some therapy, and the suggestion of the therapist was to get me involved in martial arts to help build self-confidence. So that's where my journey started. They put me in it was just a traditional Taekwondo school. It was called Shintoshi Karate. It was a hybrid somebody had come up with. More kicking, but it was Taekwondo, and they had their own sets of forms and one-steps and katas. Very traditional, a little bit of sparring, but it was nothing super intense. It was a traditional martial art. But one of my instructors was a guy named Mike Stidham. He owned another school that was a Shintoshi school, and that was his income, was from running a karate school, teaching youth. And he was one of the first guys here in Utah that had traveled over to Thailand to do kickboxing. A guy that moved to the United States, or moved to Utah. He was the first Thai fighter in Utah. His name was Saka Sim, the Punisher. They connected really early. He also, too, in high school was I think he was a runner-up or a state champion, just kind of always a scrappy kid. And he hired a lawyer for the promotion that he put on, which was called Mike Stidham's Ultimate Combat Experience, which was kind of the first MMA promotion in Utah and one of the first in the country, and one of the longest running. Every fight was professional. There was no amateur fighting at the time. It started in the early 2000s, around the Ultimate Fighter time. And he had hired a lawyer, and that lawyer was one of the very few in Utah that had graduated through the Pedro Sauer Jiu-Jitsu system. And so I was learning Kimuras and Americanas and what full guard was, and scissor, like sweeps and guillotine chokes, even before I made it into high school. And so I was passionate and fascinated with it. But the thing is I was a little kid and I was scared to death of everyone. And once I was introduced to martial arts, I thought if I could become the baddest son of a bitch on the planet, then nobody could hurt me. I wouldn't be scared of the dark. I wouldn't be scared if kids made fun of me at school. And so it's just like a little stems from that. Some of that I got from going into treatment. Later on, I found out like, oh, maybe there was something happened in your life, that caused you to be an addict, which looking back now, I realize I think I had the disease of addiction inherent in my personality long before I took my first drink or was prescribed prescription opioids. I think I had the disease of addiction inherent in my personality. I think what happened was in high school, when I started dipping into my dad's beer, I think it had a profound effect on me. And the reason why I say that is I remember the first time I drank like it was yesterday. And I mean, that was 30 years ago or 25, 26 years ago. And I was with those same cousins and I can recite it. I remember my parents had a liquor cabinet and we had friends over. There was like a work party. My cousins were there, a family party, and the adults were having mixed drinks. And me and my cousins snuck downstairs, and there was a bottle of peppermint schnapps. And we opened the bottle and we poured a cap full, and then we took a drink of it. And it was just, like strong peppermint. And all of my cousins and my brother were acting like they were drunk. They were like, oh, yeah, I feel it. And I was outside with them, like joking around. And I'm like, I don't actually feel that. And so I snuck back downstairs and I took capful after capful until I felt that warmness in my chest. And then I started to feel like, oh, I know what those guys are. This is awesome. And I don't remember if I got in trouble or not. I'm sure I got caught. I'm sure I got talked to, but that feeling was so elusive when I started drinking in high school or when I got prescribed pain pills. It's like it wasn't enough, and 1,000 was too many for sure. I had a great family. My mom and dad have been married for 45 years. I have one older brother who's well educated. I had a very loving family. I didn't grow up religious, but I grew up with very open-minded parents. My mom, she joined the LDS church basically to play basketball, and she grew up in a really rough home environment. Single mom, lots of older brothers, some gang activity, like low income, really, really rough. And then my grandfather on my mom's side was a great big piece of shit. Like left him, he was a gambling, he was a drug addict and an alcoholic. There was sexual abuse, physical abuse. He would leave for years at a time. So, and I don't know him at all. I never met him. Maybe when I was a little kid, but and then my dad, they grew up in the Midwest. They moved here. My grandfather was in the Air Force and he retired. So he ended up moving to Utah and then hired on civil service at Hill Air Force Base after he retired Air Force. And so that's why we ended up in Utah. And they would attend Baptist sermons, but I was never, it's like I would go to a Baptist sermon with my grandma and grandpa on occasion at a community church. And then my parents would be like, yeah, well, if you want to go to church with one of your friends or whatever. I mean, I grew up here in Utah, so most of the population's LDS. So they're like, yeah, you're more than welcome to go. And I enjoyed it. I had a general belief of a higher power. But in high school, I had got picked on all through middle school. My name's Courtney. And so they said I had a girl's name. And I had glasses. And back then, the glasses were great big. And so you got teased for having glasses. And one thing is, I couldn't read very well. At 24 years old, so just before making it into the Ultimate Fighter and fighting in the UFC, I had a test done and I had the reading comprehension of a third grader, like an average third grader. But vocabulary, acuity, I was pretty sharp, but I just couldn't read. And so I went through a couple of tests and I found out that I was like severely dyslexic and colorblind. And so they gave me a label sheet which was like a red hue. And then all of a sudden I could read. And it opened my eyes and I was like, I can read. But, it's like I made it all through high school. I graduated with honors. And I did that through cheating, like finding unique ways to cheat. My dad's really well read. He's a sharp guy. He was an airplane mechanic, an hydraulic technician, fuel mechanic, and electrician for like fighter jets. And my grandfather, he retired as a lieutenant colonel. He was a pilot. And so, on my dad's side, they were all pretty sharp, well read, not a lot of education, but lots of work experience, and both really sharp. And my mom went back to school. She became a nurse, but she has a challenging time reading too. And so I didn't dare tell my parents that I couldn't read. And so I was embarrassed. And I just found ways to cheat. And then I came home with good grades and nobody questioned anything. In middle school, I had a girl's name, you're a girl or whatever. I mean, it was the 90s and the early 2000s. I let it bother me a little bit, but because I was in martial arts, I didn't ever cross the line and defend myself or push them or talk back. And then I got to a point where I decided I wasn't going to get picked on anymore. And I just made a decision that wasn't going to happen anymore. And so when somebody, talked, I would say, "Oh, you want to fight?" And then they would say, "Oh," and I would, And then one thing too is I've had a wide variety of friends. I never felt like I fit in anywhere. Like I was never the popular kid. I was never like the really smart kid. It's like there's these little groups, like the skaters and the whatever. I never really fit in anywhere. Like I liked skateboarding and I liked athletics. I didn't like sports, but like we didn't watch any sports growing up. I never watched any baseball or basketball or football. Like we always did service work. Like we were always helping the old lady down the street trim her bushes. I'd always mowed lawns, and all of our family get-togethers were like work oriented. So we would always be doing service for people and helping people. We had a small farm that my grandparents were on. We were always doing stuff at. And so I never really fit in anywhere, and I didn't like getting picked on. And I got into high school, and like the third day of high school, I was in class and the teacher had a list, and there was kids that were sitting next to me, and they were definitely like the cool kids, and they were calling him gay and calling him a fag. And I answered a question and they called me a brown noser, and I was like, "Hey man, what the heck's your guys' problem?" And they were like, "Oh, what, are you fag too? And are you gay?" And just being rude high school kids. And so after class got over, and this is the third day of high school, so I was a sophomore. It was 10th, 11th, and 12th in high school I was at. Walked outside, and I was like, "Hey, dude, I don't have a problem with you. Obviously, you have a problem with me. Like, let's figure this out." And he kind of pushed me, and I was like, "Dude, don't touch me." And he's like, "What, like this?" And I said, That's your last warning." And he went to do it again, and I punched him in the throat. I took him down, and I choked him unconscious and rear naked. And I rolled him off my leg. And like from that point on, I was the fighter kid. And I didn't want to get kicked out of school. I had already started wrestling. And then right around 2000, 2001, that first year of high school, the Ultimate Fighter season 1 aired. And there was a documentary called Mark Kerr, The Smashing Machine. It was about this guy named Mark Kerr. He was an NCAA Division I national wrestling champion, and he was a freestyle world champion, and he was fighting in this organization called Pride. And I saw him and I'm like, I am going to be that guy. If I could be that guy, nobody will call me gay, nobody will like make fun of me because my name's Courtney. It's like I think that'll take care of all my problems. And so I really took wrestling serious. Over the next couple of years, I became one of the top wrestlers in the state in my weight division, and I was offered a scholarship. And during that time, I met a girl. Her name was Chelsea. I met her on the soccer field. She's the same age as me, and I absolutely fell in love with her. I was like, "Dude, this is the girl I like." And she was really pretty, and she played soccer, but she was really honest. And I was not honest. I pretended to be honest. I told stories. I was a good person. A lot of the altercations I got in were because I had friends that were getting picked on, and I didn't let them get picked on. I was a good kid, but I had to lie to make you like me. And so whatever I had to do to fit in, I did. And she did not. She came from an educated family. They were LDS, and she didn't get that good of grades. And it was because like she didn't like doing the work. And when she didn't understand it, she would just say, "Yeah, I didn't understand it. I try and I do my best, but it's not the greatest, but I'm passing." And I just thought, holy shit, how can she be so honest? That's really what attracted me to her. I mean, outside of that, of course, she was like, she was super cute, and she was a soccer player. So like that was a thing too. But it was the honesty deep down inside, and it still is, that attracts me to my wife, is that she is super honest, and I just really looked up to her for that. So I started chasing her, and I decided I was going to be the best wrestler that I could be so that I could be a UFC fighter. And I had a few interactions. My drinking took on a bigger role. In the summer, I worked full time on the Air Force Base doing landscaping. I started doubt like guys had pain pills. I mean, that was kind of the start of the OxyContin epidemic. Purdue Pharma, we're a state where they didn't. There was more problems in our state than there was in some other states for a few different reasons, but either way, there was an influx of OxyContin that was prescribed to standard patients. So patients that had pain, but not terminal cancer patients, which originally was kind of what OxyContin or that high of dose opioid was for. And so I got into an accident. I shattered my collarbone, and I was an arm wrestler, and I had ripped off the growth plate in my left elbow in a state arm wrestling tournament. And so I had surgery on my collarbone and then surgery on my elbow. And they prescribed me Oxycontin, like 10 milligram Oxycontin. And at the suggestion of one of my close friends who also had a prescription for Oxycontin, he had fallen off of a building working and herniated some discs or ruptured some discs in his back. And so he was prescribed Oxycontin. And at the suggestion of a friend to him to suck the coating off, crush it up, and snort it, he was like, "Dude, if you have any extra, I'll pay you $10 a piece for them." And I was like, "Holy cow! I have 30 of them. Like that's good money." And then my next thought was like, "Well, wait a minute. If you're willing to pay that much money, what are you doing with them?" And he was like, "I suck the coating off, I crush it up, and I snort it." And he said, "It takes care of my pain, and I feel really good." And growing up, I was not the kid that was snorting pixie sticks. I dipped into my dad's beer. I had some issues. I had got arrested for a DUI. I had gotten lots of fights, like altercations that I'd got in trouble with. So I was not in good terms with Layton City Police Department. I worked full time. All the money I made went to pay for court, like court fines, lawyer fees, and restitution. And I would straighten up by the time I was back in school. And I would not let anything get in the way of my wrestling season. And then when wrestling was done, I was offered a full ride scholarship to a local, like a college that wasn't too far from here, up in Wyoming. And I found out because of Title IX, I couldn't accept out of state tuition. So women's and men's fairness in sports. So I couldn't take an athletic scholarship, and I didn't have good enough test scores to get a academic scholarship. I had good grades, but not good enough test scores. And so, number one, I was mad that I wasn't going to wrestle because I didn't want to go to college to get an education. I wanted to get an education in wrestling so that I could fight in the UFC. I wanted to be a professional. I wanted to be the baddest son of a bitch on the planet. And once I lost that, I got into an accident. I shattered my collarbone. I needed my elbow fixed. I was prescribed those Oxycontin. I sucked off the coating. I snorted it. And I was like, if I don't like it, I won't ever do it again. And I didn't get high the first time I did it. It was really uncomfortable. It burnt my nose. And I was like, I'm going to try it one more time. And I did it one more time, and it hit me like $1,000,000. And all of a sudden I thought, well, it's okay that I'm not going to college to wrestle. Maybe I still will go to college, but I'll just follow my brother to Weber State. I don't have any idea what I'm going to do, but it's all right. I'll figure it out. So basically, I had multiple felony charges. I acquired 4 DUIs, 3 more on top of the one that I had. I got in so much trouble over the next 18 months. So 6 months after dropping out of my first year of college and 18 months after high school graduation, I was homeless. I had lost multiple jobs. I had quit jobs before I got fired and then would hire on at another one. I would try to get sober, get off all the pills. I would quit drinking for a couple of weeks, and then I would go do it because usually you had to do a piss test. I would do a clean piss test. I would hire on, and then I would start drinking again, and I would start using, and then pretty soon I would almost lose the job and I would leave. And Chelsea, my girlfriend at the time, she was getting sick of me. It's not my fault, just blamed everybody for my problems. It wasn't my drinking, I didn't want to look at the drinking. I didn't want to look at the using, and I lost absolutely everything. I got kicked out of my house. I ended up rolling my Jeep. I got kicked out of my little apartment. I begged my cousin to let me move into her trailer. I promised her that I was sober. She was in recovery at the time. I moved in. A couple of weeks prior to that, I had shot heroin for the first time, intravenous. And I figured as long as I could have a little bit of heroin periodically throughout the day. I could find a job and I could just do that. And yeah, I ended up being a little too pure, a little too much. But September 9th, 2005, it was a Sunday. I shot up and I went into a bathroom. I shot up. There was a girl there with me and she heard me hit the floor. So she came in and tried to open the door, but I was kind of wedged between the door and the toilet. And, it was a trailer, so it was kind of a flimsy door. So she saw me laying there. She started freaking out. My cousin and her friend came in at the same time. She was sitting there and they ended up calling 911. He kind of broke the door down. He pulled me out. He was an EMT, so he started chest compressions. And then my cousin, Brianna, called 911. Just so happens, like less than 100 feet from the trailer from where I overdosed, there was a call. And what happened is it was a false alarm. So somebody had called 911 and the ambulance showed up and it ended up being a false alarm. So basically, when they called 911, there was an ambulance within 100 feet of the trailer where I had overdosed. And they came directly over. They started CPR. They loaded me up. My parents got there pretty quick and they did CPR and defibrillations. I think it was for like 16 minutes. I can't remember what the report said, but basically, like I had no pulse and no heartbeat for about 8 minutes. So just the chest compressions providing oxygen to my brain is what saved my noodle. I mean, had the ambulance not been there, I wouldn't be here. And then on top of it, when they called and they were working on me on the way to the hospital, there was a narcotics officer. His name's Brady Fitzpatrick, and he had arrested me probably like 20 times. Like the dude knew everything about me. It's like, oh, great, it's court again. And he overheard a male, blah, 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 20 years old or 21 years old, Court McGee. And so he drove straight there. And had he had not taken that call, 100% I wouldn't be here. So I didn't have any track marks. I had just started using heroin. I'd only used heroin for maybe a month or something. So I didn't have track marks. I didn't have any like drug charges related to heroin. And the trailer that I was in was not a drug trailer. Like my cousin was a former drug addict, but had got sober. So it was clean. There was no drugs, there was no alcohol, there was no paraphernalia. The trailer was really clean. So when he came in, what happened was when I shot up, the syringe that I shot up with had fallen in between the linoleum and the wall next to the toilet. And then my little heroin kit was in a glass case. So I have glasses. I had a glass case. So it was shut and it was just sitting on the counter. So he came in, he found the syringe and he opened up the glass case and found the spoon and the lighter and the stuff that I used to cook the heroin. And he called dispatch and said, "Hey, it's a heroin overdose. I found a syringe." Had he had not done that, I don't think they would have Narcan me. So naloxone was not around, so that not every single person had naloxone. I mean, this was 2000. Oxycontin had not reached its height yet, its prescription height. So that was roughly in 2009 or 2010. And then they kind of changed the prescription and some other stuff happened. They had the half prescription law 2 years later. So like it was almost at its height. There was not a huge influx of heroin yet. So there was not a ton of overdoses. And then fentanyl was not even really a thing. They had fentanyl patches, but very few people used them. And so there wasn't as many overdoses. And so he found the syringe and he called. They said, "Hey, it's a heroin overdose." And so they Narcan me while I was in there, but they couldn't get a response. They did CPR, they did defibrillations. And then, yeah, he called and they administered Narcan, reversed the effects. And then they induced me into a coma. And I'm not sure how long I was in there. I think it was less than 24 hours, but I'm not 100% sure. But when I came to, there was a licensed clinical social worker who specialized in substance abuse. And he's also like me now. So I'm coming up on 19 years of sobriety. So April 16th will be my 19 year. If I make it, will be my 19-year sobriety birthday. He had 20 years of sobriety and was a former heroin addict. And so when that guy sat there and talked to me, I knew he knew, like I wanted to stop years before that. I wanted to stop before I left high school. I wanted to be wrestling in college so that I could go be a UFC fighter. I didn't want to lose my girlfriend and get kicked out of my parents' house and steal their stuff. I didn't want to be known as a drug addict. I mean, I wanted to stop using, but I could not stop or limit the amount. As soon as I started, I could not stop. I couldn't manage it. I wasn't doing it for fun anymore. I was doing it to maintain so that I could go to work, so that I could be a normal person. And I just could not do it. And that guy talked to me for 5 minutes. And I was like, holy shit, this guy knows exactly how I feel. And he said, okay, listen. He said, I was in the same position. What I did is I went to inpatient drug treatment. I stayed there and I started going to 12-step meetings. And I listened to the way the people felt. And I didn't look at the differences like in age or, or religion or how well they're dressed. I listened to how they felt. And I was like, okay, I can do that. So I ended up going to drug treatment and I stayed there for 30 days and I did just that. I went to these 12-step meetings and I sat there and listened to these people. And almost every one of them told my story. They felt different. They didn't feel adequate. They did anything to fit in. And then once they found their drug, it was like, this is the best thing ever. And this will make me a better employee and I can fit in and I can be okay at the bar with my friends or I can show up for my kids. And it's just like I was in Utah and most people don't drink coffee in the morning. Yet for me, it was okay if I just did a little bit of cocaine or a little bit of meth to get me going, and it's just like most people don't drink coffee. And I'm sitting here hot railing meth at 7 in the morning so that I could go to work. That is not a normal, healthy thing. And I just heard my story. I knew that's what I needed to do. And basically, to make a very long story shorter, I listened to what they said. I started to do what they suggested to do to maintain my recovery. So I got a sponsor. I started attending meetings regularly. I had 3 relapses. They were just like one-time relapse. Somebody had handed me some pills. I didn't even think about it. I just took them. And then I'm like, oh shit. And basically at the time I had what was called a sponsor who kind of guides you through the 12-step program and who is also sober and had been through the 12-step program. And I called him, hey, I took this pill. He's like, okay, you got to restart your sobriety. You go to these meetings, you tell them you're a newcomer. You have to start over. And so I started over. I did it one more time, and then I stayed sober for about 5.5 months. I got into a relationship with a girl in the meetings that I met that I had no business getting into a relationship with. She's a lot older than me. We had nothing in common. The only thing we had in common is we both was going to 12-step meetings and trying to stay sober, but way different lives. And so that was not healthy, but she bought me a ticket to UFC 57. And it was for my birthday. I had a sober 21st birthday. And she said, do you want to go? And it was a little bit after my birthday. So I went and it was Chuck Liddell versus Randy Couture. And I was a huge Randy Couture fan. And everybody knew who Chuck Liddell was at the time. He was a legend. But I loved Randy because of his wrestling. And so I sat up in the nosebleeds watching this fight. It was incredible. And then Randy got knocked out. And I was a little devastated, but it's like it was cool. I got to be there and I'm like, this is what I want to do. It like reignited that spark and that desire. And I already had cauliflower ear. And one of the guys sitting next to me was like, hey, you look familiar. And do you train? And I was like, oh, yeah, you'll see me out here in a couple years. And I was like, totally bullshit, like lying through my teeth. Like I had started training again, but like there was no way I was in any position to compete in the UFC. I had not fought yet. And it was in my first 6 months of sobriety. I had just turned 21. I was sober. And after we left, I was with my girlfriend. Her name was Lisa at the time. And she had a Diet Coke with lime, and I went over to take a drink of it, and she said, no, don't drink that. And I'm like, what do you mean? Uh, she was like, there's alcohol in it. And I was like, you relapse? And she said, yeah, I've been drinking for the last month. And I had been with her, living with her, and I didn't even notice. And she was like, yeah, I've been able to manage it and maintain it. And I was like, wow, how do you do that? And it was really challenging because I knew I couldn't drink and she was drinking, but it seemed like she was doing okay. And she bought me a Long Island iced tea and she said, hey, you're 21 now. You have almost 6 months of sobriety. Maybe we drink tonight and then tomorrow we'll both start over. And I put the Long Island iced tea up to my lips and I had this horrible feeling like you are making a huge mistake. And I set the drink down, and she said, it touched your lips. That's pretty much a relapse. And I'm not blaming her for me drinking, but I was like, yeah, you're right. And then I drank it, and it led to the worst 2 weeks and one day of my entire life. Worse than my fatal heroin overdose, than them breaking my sternum. I mean, it took me several weeks to learn how to walk again after my overdose. I had no idea where I was at. When they dropped me off at treatment, I thought I was at Humpty Dumpty, which was my preschool. I forgot who my parents were. I mean, I was a fucking mess. And to think that that drink was going to be okay, it so wasn't. And it led to the worst 2 weeks in one day of my life. 4 days later, I ended up in Iowa. The people I was with took my pants from me because they didn't think I was going to leave and find meth. I had hurt two of my closest friends. I got into a couple of fights. I stole stuff from a gas station. Like, I did more bad shit in 2 weeks of drinking than I did in my whole drinking and using career. And I came home. I didn't have a place to live, so I knocked on my parents' door and I said, I need a place to stay for one night. And they thought I was sober, and they said, okay, we'll let you stay for one night. And so I went inside, and my dad hid his beer. He drank Milwaukee's Best. And so I saw him carry it upstairs and hide it in his room, just so I didn't have access to it. And I stole a beer, and I went downstairs, and I was going to open the beer, and I set it down, and I heard my dad walking across the kitchen floor and walk down the stairs. And he looked at me, and he said, son, I thought you weren't supposed to drink. And I looked at the beer, and I looked at him, and I looked at the clock, and it was like 1:30 in the morning. It was April 16th, 2006. And I just inside just said, I'm fucking done. And my dad looked at me when he said, I thought you weren't supposed to drink. And when I overdosed, I had this crazy vision of my grandfather looking at me disappointed. And I really looked up to my grandpa. And I saw that same image when he looked at me. And I just knew I was fucking done. And I was like, I don't care what I have to do. I'm done. And
Yeah.
that was 6,809 days ago. I was willing to do anything to stay sober. And that's really when my life started. So April 16th, 2006. So at 21 years old, I had 6 months or almost 6 months of sobriety, and I had a sober 21st birthday. And it showed me that if I took even one drink, where it would lead me. And so after that, I decided I was going to turn myself in. I called the district attorney and my drug court liaison, and I said, hey, I drank, I left the state, I went to Las Vegas. And she's like, stop talking. Don't say anything else. Just be here on Friday. We'll talk. So I didn't incriminate myself. I didn't care. I wanted to go to prison. I was like, maybe that's my best option. If they lock me away, then I can have 3 meals a day. I can definitely defend myself while I'm in there. And that's how I'll get sober. And that was a Monday. And my dad had introduced me to somebody. He said, hey, I have a friend that owns a plumbing company. I think you ought to go see if you can get a job. And so, and I didn't even argue. I was just like, okay, I'll go do an interview. So I showed up on Wednesday to this plumbing guy, Doug Porter. And hey, he's like, tell me about yourself. And I was like, I have 2 days of sobriety. I have to go to these 12-step meetings, and more than likely, I'm going to be going to prison. I don't think you're going to hire me. And he was like, great. Sounds like we can go to meetings together. And I'm like, wait, what? And he hired me. He said, yeah, we can work through stuff like this. I mean, he was a longtime AA guy. So I was like, okay. And I showed up to my meeting with the district attorney at the time on that Friday. And I told her everything that happened. And she said, all right, I'm not going to violate you, but I am going to send you to program called Nuke. It was clinical consultants. It was on 25th Street in Ogden, and it was all guys fresh out of the state penitentiary who had to go to this Friday meeting for 2 to 3 hours to basically like be reintubated back into society. And I mean, I don't know how she decided to put me in there, but it couldn't have been more perfect. Like, number one, I was asking to go to prison. I had bad enough charges to go to prison, like felony drug charges, inciting a riot, criminal mischief, felony DUIs. I mean, you name it. Like, I had enough trouble to go to prison. But she saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. So I went to those meetings. I was scared to death. Everybody had tattoos that, they'd all been in prison. And I sat there and I heard my story. I heard the charges, only I had not been to prison yet. But I also saw they had missed out on family. They had missed out on education. They didn't know how to put in an application. They had missed this big stretch of time while they were in prison. And I was just like, wow, okay, I'm very lucky. And so it gave me some gratitude for my position. I started attending regular 12-step meetings. I started working. And after 4 or 5 weeks, I went sober bowling with a group of 12-step guys, just a bunch of old guys, basically. And I was in the bowling alley and I looked over and I saw Chelsea. And she had moved to Russia to teach English. So she left me. She was like, hey, I'm done. And then she was really done. She moved all the way across the world. And she thought I had passed away. Her mom worked intake at the hospital when I was brought in, and she thought I was involved in a fatal accident. And so she didn't know what had happened to me. And she saw me and was really surprised. And I gave her a big hug. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you look great. And was just talking to her. And she's like, Court, you don't smell like beer. And I was like, I haven't drank anything. And I didn't tell her about the heroin at the time. I don't think she knew I got that bad. She knew I did cocaine and was snorting Oxycontin, but she didn't know about the heroin. And I was like, no, I'm completely sober. And she said it was everything that she wanted minus the alcohol. And she was engaged to somebody. And I was also engaged to that woman that I was dating that I relapsed with. And so we kind of separated from each other and then started seeing each other. So that was off to a pretty rough start, but it couldn't have happened better. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Chelsea. And she's like, oh my gosh, it's Court. And he's sober. And so she separated from her guy. And then I separated from my girl. We started dating. I started working and I went to the high school that I graduated from. I started coaching wrestling. And then I went to a jiu-jitsu gym. And in my first year of competition and my first year of sobriety, I had 10 amateur boxing matches, 2 semi-pro boxing tournaments, 2 professional boxing matches, 7 professional MMA fights, and I competed in probably about 20 jiu-jitsu tournaments. So I had about 40 to 60 competition jiu-jitsu matches, and that was in 1 year. I was working full time. I was going to meet, like, when I tell you, like, my whole life revolved around my next fix. With that removed and a little bit of recovery, I had more energy than I'd ever had. And I was in a position to be honest. So, like, when I couldn't read something, I told somebody, hey, I'm not very good at reading. I decided I wasn't going to lie anymore and I wasn't going to pretend to be somebody that I wasn't. I was just going to be me. And that was the biggest change. And I did have a few issues, a few problems, like my son, Isaac, who made me late for this podcast. I dropped off at school today. He's 17. He's a senior in high school. He was on the way. So it was a surprise. Chelsea called me and she's like, hey, Court, I got to tell you something. We need to talk. And I'm like, I don't do the we need to talk thing. You just come over and tell me what. And I thought I had got caught for something. I thought like I was going to get arrested or somebody had found some drugs or I got another charge. And she was like, no, Court, I'm pregnant. And I'm like, what? Is that all? Super pumped. Like I knew I wanted to move her. I knew I wanted to be with her. So I had no issues with that. However, like that is a big decision. It's a big thing, but that was not my main concern. Basically, like the plea in abeyance that I was in, had I had violated and got charged, I would have served 14 years on mandatory minimums. So the least amount of time I would have served was 14 years. And that's essentially like the 5 felonies and then the 3 misdemeanors would have been charged to the fullest extent. And I would have been gone. So early on, I told Chelsea, I absolutely love you. I'll do anything to be with you, but I can't marry you until I have 2 years of sobriety. And I just told myself that. And I don't know if that was the right thing or the wrong thing, but that's what I felt. Because to be an addict, you have to lie, you have to cheat, you have to manipulate. And if you get rid of the drugs and alcohol, when I got rid of those drugs and alcohol, that didn't change me completely. Like all of a sudden I was sober, I had a bunch of energy, but I was still doing dumb shit that I was doing when I was using and drinking. Those things don't change overnight. Those things take time. Going to work, going to practices. And once I started to have success in training and competition, my recovery took a back step. And I knew the most important thing was I needed to stay sober. I was going to enough meetings to hear that, to hear my story. but I wasn't willing to fully delve into the 12-step program. I just worked the first 3 steps. And I think that kept me sober for the first 3 years. I think it really did. But in that first year, I had a friend who, there was basically 2 friends that I grew up with in my neighborhood, Brady and Cody. And we were great friends. And then pretty soon, the only thing we had in common was using and everything that involves using. So finding it, getting it. My one friend I had separated myself from. The other friend, he asked for help. And called my sponsor at the time and he said, "Hey, listen, you can invite him to a meeting, but don't go help him. You don't have anything to offer that guy. You cannot give that which you do not have, and you don't have anything to give that guy. Invite him to the meetings. Introduce him to somebody who has worked the steps and been sober for several years. You know, you're starting over." So, like, I was working full time. Like, I had to pay for piss tests. I was looking to go to prison. Like, if I made one mistake, goodbye. And he was like, "Hey, I need some help." And so I asked my guy, and he said, "Dude, don't hang around him." He's like, "If you hang out in a barber shop long enough, you get your hair cut." He said, "If you hang around somebody you used to use with, you're going to end up using." That's what happens. And I thought I was different. So I told that kid, "Hey, let's go to Cabela's. We'll get some fishing tackle. We'll go to a meeting and we'll go fishing sober," because that's what we used to do together, is fish a lot. And we got to Cabela's. He went in the bathroom and he snorted a bunch of pills, came out. He was definitely high. I got really upset. I was like, "Dude, how dare you do this? You know, how dare a drug addict use drugs?" And I took him home. I basically carried him to his room and laid him down and was like, "Dude, I can't hang out with you until you really want to get sober. You have to want it." And it was his prescription. It was Xanax. The doctor definitely didn't prescribe him to snort like 3 or 4 milligrams, but that's what he did. And he's like, "It's my prescription. You know, I'm not using." And his mom overheard the conversation. She was in the other room. And part of the rules of him being at home still was that he had to be sober. And so she overheard that he was high. And you know, it was his prescription, but he definitely had abused it. And she overheard the conversation. I left the house and she threatened to kick him out. And he was like, "No, it was court that was loaded. It wasn't me. I'm trying to help," like, kind of turn the story around.
Wow.
And then basically kind of like freaked out and made up some crazy drug story, just kind of like drug addicts do, and said that I had pushed him or punched him or something. And so she said, "Well, if that's true, then call the police." Oh, I was scared to death. And so he called the police, and Brady Fitzpatrick, the same guy responsible for me being alive today, showed up at my house like 10 minutes later and was like, "Hey, were you at Brady Vega's house?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, trying to help him." And
Yeah.
he said, "I'm sorry, dude. You entered his house with the intent to harm him." He said you assaulted him. And I was like, I carried him into his house. And I didn't even tell him that he was loaded. I wasn't completely honest. And I said, "Man, I went in there to try and help him." And he said, "I have to arrest you for burglary, entering his house with the intent to harm him." And he let me call my boss. He let me call my parents. I called Chelsea. I called everybody. And I said, "I have to go to jail." And I got arrested. And the crazy thing is, I asked to go to prison, you know, just about a year before that. And then I was almost out of the trees, out of the forest, and I was trying to help, but you cannot give that which you do not have. I got arrested. My drug court liaison and the district attorney showed up, and I didn't have money for a lawyer. My parents weren't going to pay for a lawyer either. So I had a court appointed attorney, and he said, "Hey, you need to do a plea bargain." He said, "Otherwise, dude, you're going to go away for a long time." I think he was going to get me like 6 to 9 years. I told him no. I said, "This is the only time I've been arrested, literally the only time I've been arrested, and I didn't do it. And I'm going to take it to a jury trial." And he's like, "Dude, I don't have the time for that." He probably had a million cases, you know, like low hanging fruit. Let's just get this guy through. And I said, "No, I'm not going to do it." I had been going to meetings. I got signatures at every meeting, hundreds of meetings that I went to. I was doing what I thought I was supposed to be doing. I'd passed all my piss tests. I was following all the rules. Isaac was born. I wanted to marry Chelsea. I had become probably the top, if not the top, close to the top fighter in the entire state in like 6 to 8 months. I just was like, there's no way. And so I decided that I was going to take it to a jury trial. I went back to work. I kept training. I got a shot to try out for Ultimate Fighter Season 7. Now, I wasn't supposed to leave the state, and I flew all the way to New Jersey. I didn't have the money to fly there. And so I ended up making it out to New Jersey. I did the tryout. I made it to the physical tryouts. Made it through like the grappling and the striking portion. And then the interview is reality television. So you're trying out for a television show. And so they ask you whatever questions. And I was like, oh, I deserve this. And, my whole life. And this is my last chance. And they didn't like it. It was like every other guy in there. I had the record to get in there, but it's like, I'm so glad I didn't make it. I mean, what the hell was I thinking? I was going to be on a jury trial. Like, what if I would have went on the Ultimate Fighter house? And I wasn't thinking at all. I'm like, where's Court? I didn't get called back, thank God. And then I had signed to fight a guy named Jeremy Horn, and I thought that was my ticket into the UFC, into the Ultimate Fighter. He was a prolific fighter. He'd fought everybody, and I was in, like, they wouldn't even sanction that fight now. I showed up, I fought him, and I lost. I didn't get the call back for the Ultimate Fighter, and I was devastated that I wasn't going to make it on the Ultimate Fighter. And then I went to my jury trial and I took the stand and basically said I was told not to hang out with him because I didn't have anything to offer him. I love my friend Brady, and I went there to try and help him find a way of life that I have found, which is in recovery. My sponsor showed up and was there, and he vouched for me. I had a list of about 200 meetings, like 12-step meetings that I had attended. And I was doing everything. I was paying my fines, my court fines, my fees. I was paying for SR22 insurance. I had my driver's license back. I was working full time, and they saw that. And so they found me not guilty. So that was a huge relief.
Yeah.
But I didn't get the call back, and I lost my fight to Jeremy Horn. And so it was like, you win some, you lose some. And then after that, I was like, okay, it's been about 2 years. And so I asked Chelsea to marry me. She said yes. We moved down here to Utah County, and I gave myself 2 years to make it. I said, if I don't make it in 2 years, I'm going to go back and be a commercial plumber. So I quit my plumbing job. I moved down to this gym down here. I started working at the gym, barely making it. And right at about 2 years, so I had about 3 years of sobriety. I was married. I had a son. We were living right behind the gym, and I was dying inside. I had 3 years of sobriety. I had everything I thought you needed to have to be happy. I was married. My wife and my son loved me. I was definitely the top fighter. I couldn't even find a fight. It was impossible to find a fight. I was like 11-1. I had lost a close decision to Jeremy Horn. I had won everything you could win, and I was jealous of my teammates that were making it. I was mad at my boss. I was like, man, I'm only making $10 an hour, and I blew out my knee, and I had to go have surgery. And it was right before Christmas, and I was like, oh my gosh. And I went through this surgery sober. So I left. I didn't take any pain medication. My wife filled the prescription, and she had the prescription at home, and I went to the gym, and I was at the supplement shop making drinks and making, shakes and teaching classes. And I had this thought, maybe I'll go home and take a couple of pain pills and just watch a show and it'll be fine. And then I had that feeling that I had when I took that sip of that Long Island iced tea. You're not making a good decision. And no shit, a kid was in treatment and he had a day furlough to come work out at the gym. It was a deal we had with a recovery center here in Utah County. And he came up to me and he said, hey, somebody said you go to 12-step meetings. And I was like, yeah, I haven't been to one in a while, but I probably should go. I said, will you drive? And he said, yeah, I can drive. And I was like, 2 or 3 days post-op. I had to be at work. I mean, the bills were due. It was the end of the month. So I went to this meeting and I got asked to share. And I just got honest. And I was like, I have 3 years of sobriety. I am completely miserable. I don't want to go home to my wife and son. And it's not because I don't love them. I feel like I'm not giving them enough. I'm jealous of everybody around me. I'm not fighting in the organization I deserve to be in. And I blew my knee out and I want to go home and take pain pills. But I know I can't. And my car is a piece of shit. And this like jolly dude walked up to me. He's kind of, hey, doesn't sound like you've worked the steps. And I was like, yeah, well, you want to take me through them? I got his number. And over the next 4 months, I went through the steps with that guy. My attitude and outlook on life completely changed. All of a sudden, I realized my car got me to and from work and up to my family's house. My wife and son loved me and loved when I came home. I had been completely self-supporting. I had been completely sober. I just made it through a surgery, completely non-narcotic. all of a sudden I was like the same person, but completely different.
Yeah,
And
perspective.
yeah. And through working the steps with that guy, I built a relationship, like a true relationship with a higher power. And that changed my life. I had a couple of spiritual experiences. And now all of a sudden, I decided that I would show up and just do my best. Somebody showed up to the gym and was like, hey, you should try out for season 11 of The Ultimate Fighter. And I was honest. I was like, hey, man, I could go try out, but I would miss out on the 500 bucks I make a week. And I have a wife and son, and I don't have anybody to help me pay bills. I said, I wouldn't be able to do that. And it was this guy named Will Farah. He ended up buying the gym later. It turns out he was worth a fortune. And he was like, well, hey, I'd be willing to cover what you would miss while you're here, and I'll pay for your flights. And I was like, what do you want? And he's like, nothing, just for you to succeed. And so I called Chelsea and I was like, hey, this guy wants to pay for it. And she's like, well, what does he want? He says nothing. She's like, well, take it, dummy. And I was like, okay. And so I took it. I went and I tried out. And the only thing different this time is when they asked me, what makes you different than anybody else here? I said, well, they were like, let me guess, it's your last shot. You know, you got to go back to work. You deserve to be in the UFC. I mean, it was exactly the position I was in. But I didn't look at it that way. I was like, no, I've made it this far. I'm doing good. I said, the only thing that makes me different is September 9th, 2005, I had a fatal unintentional heroin overdose. I was intending on taking the heroin, but not dying. I got sober April 16th, 2006. If I stay sober for another couple of months, I'll have 4 years of continuous sobriety. And I have a gnarly criminal history. And they were like, great. That sounds great. Yeah, we like you. Get out of here. And so a couple of days later, they called me and they said, hey, you made it. And immediately I thought, there's no way I can go on this show. Because I know they put you in a house. I know there's alcohol. And I was like, dude, what if I make it on there and I win it? And I'm famous all of a sudden. I was like, there's no way I could stay sober. And so I called my sponsor at the time and I was like, dude, I'm scared to death to go on here. He's like, well, let me ask you a few questions, Court. He's like, could you better financially provide for your family? Because I know that worries you a lot. And that's one of your main concerns. And I was like, yeah, if I even make it on the show, my stock will go up when I fight. I could work full time and fight part time, and I would make 3 times as much as I make now. And he's like, okay, well, what if you win it? And I was like, it's like a 6-figure contract, and you become a UFC fighter. It's probably life changing. He's like, well, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
And he's like, outside of that, it's a reality television show, and he understood television. He was a pretty accomplished musician, so he had been in that kind of realm. And he said, if you make it on there, through sharing your story, do you think you could possibly help somebody who's struggling with addiction? And I was like, man, millions of people will see this, Dave. And he's like, maybe you ought to think about that. Have you prayed? And I said, no. And so I sat down, I said a prayer. Man, I didn't get anything from the prayer. I was super sore and I did an Epsom salt bath and I was sitting in that Epsom salt bath, like kind of zoning out. And I had the clearest image of me holding up the Ultimate Fighter trophy. And I was like, God damn it, I got to go.
Wow.
And so I called him back and I said, I'll be there. Yeah. And I showed up. I lost my first fight. I ended up coming back. I won it. I dedicated my fight to all those who are struggling. And then I decided from that point on that I was going to be open with my story, but I needed to be armed with a solution before I offered help, which I had done that. I started sponsoring people in that 12-step program, which totally changed my life. That's my number one thing. I achieved recovery. And so the number one thing I can do to not go back is by giving that away. And so me working with people who struggle with addiction is kind of my number one resource to not going back. Helps me give back. It gives me relative. It helps me, be a better dad. And, it's like, it's the most important thing I do in my life. That was in 2010, and I mean, it's 2024. I've had one of the longest careers in the history of the UFC. Financially, paid myself essentially what I made as a plumber when I was plumbing to maintain my career. And it's boded pretty well. And I've had so many incredible experiences, but
Yeah.
like funny ones, like I was super scared to go to a bar. Now, I never drank in a bar, not one time. I only drank legally one time, and that was my relapse. And so I was told by my recovery group, like, hey, we don't go to bars. And I had won the Ultimate Fighter. I was fighting in the UFC, and my manager was like, hey, they're doing this autograph session at Blondie's bar in Las Vegas. We want to fly you out there. You'll do an autograph session, and you'll have somebody there with you that's also doing an autograph session, and it's $5,000. And I was like, holy cow. My first thought, because I had made some money from the show, and I wasn't like, oh shoot, I don't know how to pay my bill. I'm going to be able to pay my bills next month. So I was a little more comfortable, and I called my sponsor and I was like, dude, there's no way I can go to this bar. I'm not supposed to go to bars. And he was like, well, do you have any good reason to be there? And I was like, well, they're going to pay me $5,000. He's like, yeah. He's like, well, are you nervous you're going to relapse? And I said, no. I mean, I had over 5 years of sobriety at the time. And he said, well, if you're not really nervous, like we're supposed to be able to go anywhere in the world, what if there's somebody there that needs help and sees you not drink and that inspires them to not drink? He's like, maybe it's not really about you. Maybe you ought to take that opportunity. And so I showed up and I went, and it was a viewing of a UFC fight. And then it was this MMA awards. And so the person that was signing autographs with me was Steve-O, like from Jackass Steve-O.
Okay.
And I was like, holy shit, this is Steve-O. So I sat down and talked to him, and I decided I was going to go. So I went, and the person I was doing autographs with was Steve-O. And he was going to the MMA awards. He was a big MMA fan. And so I sat there, and somebody bought me a beer and offered me a beer. And I was like, oh, thanks. And I didn't tell him I didn't drink or anything. I just kind of pushed it aside, and I didn't want to tell him I didn't drink. And he walked off, and I pushed the beer away, and he was like, oh, you don't drink? And I was like, no, man, I'm a member of a 12-step program. And he pulled his medallion out. He's a member of the same program as me. And I was like, holy shit. And so he sat there and he told me basically how to stay sober and be famous. And so I went there, and Steve-O, he told me a bunch of stories about some things that he went through and kind of how he navigated that being in recovery. And I got so much from that, got paid, came back, and I'm like, holy cow. And so ever since then, like I really followed Steve-O really close. And every time I see him, it's like, what's up, dude? And I've had some really crazy highlights. Like I turned down a joint from Snoop Dogg. And most people would be like, I smoked a joint with Snoop Dogg. But for me being in recovery, I was like, hey man, I lost the privilege to smoke weed, dude. And he's like, I get it, man. So yeah, I have 3 sons now. I've been married for 16 years to Chelsea. We've been together for roughly 24 years, minus the 1 year that we weren't together when I got really bad. I have built a relationship with her family that is really close. I have rebuilt the relationship with my mother and my father. I have become the professional athlete that I know my sons can look up to. And it's like, you've met me in the gym when I'm teaching, like the person that you see on interviews, post-fight stuff for the UFC is the same person that I am
Yeah,
at
100%.
the gym, is the same person I am when I'm coaching my son's wrestling. And recovery has given me that. It has kept my feet firmly planted on the ground because it has been a crazy whirlwind. I've had some really successful nights. There's a few times where I've made more money than I made in multiple years in one night. And I could have just blown through that. I could have fallen victim to thinking, oh, I need a bigger house, or I need a different girlfriend, or I need to cheat on my wife, or, and it's just like, I have become the person I never thought I could be, like way different. I'm so grateful. And I don't have to pretend to be anybody I'm not today. I can lead by example. And the example that I lay is staying in today, being honest about who I really am. And I have a few things that I do every day. So I use prayer. During COVID, I had a friend who does a lot of guided breathing, and he had been talking to me for years about guided breathing. And I'm like, yeah, I breathe all the time. Like I didn't listen to him. And then finally I listened to him. And he sent me a link to Wim Hof's guided breathing bubble. And so it's just a method of breathing, and it was very euphoric, and it was a fantastic form of meditation. I didn't start doing it until like 2020, maybe like late 2019. That's my form of meditation. So I read and I do some form of meditation, and I talk to another person in recovery every day, no matter what. I don't go without. Outside of that, I just try to be present and be grateful for today, because you never know what's going to happen. And if I'm worrying about tomorrow and I'm worrying about yesterday, I'm peeing on today. Doesn't matter what we're doing. Like, pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. So if I'm going through pain, I am growing, and I know no matter what, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And with the group of people in long-term recovery I've surrounded myself in, it doesn't matter what I go through, I know I'll be okay. And then I've built a relationship with a higher power that I trust and I communicate with every day. And I don't necessarily know what it is, but it's a God of my understanding. And I live such a good life today. I get to be present for tough things, for challenging things, for ups, for downs. And I do more in one day than I used to do in months. And I get to be a part of it. I don't look at things as like, oh, I have to do this. It's like I got rear-ended. I had to drop a vehicle off today. And it was a great opportunity for my son to see how those things are managed and taken care of. And, getting him to school, him dropping me off, him being a part of it. I'm heading over to train with one of my students who is competing next weekend in Pocatello, and I'm going to be his partner for conditioning, being present for this podcast. Right now, this is the most important thing that I do today. So it's like I just try to stay in the moment. I try not to get too far ahead of myself because I don't trust my brain, and I stay in the moment. And as long as I'm willing to be of service to the person who struggles, like, it continues to bode well for my attitude. It helps me to be present. Now that I've partnered with Dane and Amy, Dane and Amy own Agima, and it's an opportunity for me to give back, number one. Plus, I don't know. I mean, I've had like 5 or 6 hours in the UFC octagon, but I probably have like either maybe 10 to 15,000 hours of training. I'm going to lose that if I don't give it away. Plus, I'm passionate about it and I love it. I live a good life today.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. I'm so honored to be able to share this space and time with you and to hear your journey. And there's some common themes. One, it's really important who you surround yourself with. Super important. Two, trusting your intuition, being present in the moment to allow yourself to know when to do something or when not to do something. Three, developing that relationship with a higher power. There are so many cool, you could say like coincidences, but they weren't coincidences. Allowing God to work in your life and having that personal relationship with God. I just think that's so important for everybody. I do just want to say thank you again. And your most recent fight took place with the UFC 307 in Salt Lake City. I just think that's so cool, like full circle here. You won against Tim Means with the rear naked choke in the first round.
Yes.
Amazing. What was the first thought that like went through your head when that happened?
I don't know what my first thought was. I just remember, so I had a neck surgery. I had a neck injury. I think it was like 2017 or 2018. So I had this injury for about 5 years, and I fought roughly 10 times. And I finally decided I was going to get it fixed. I got it fixed, and I had a fight, and I was going to hang it up, but I didn't. I had felt better than I felt in years. And I had a really close fight, but I was tentative, kind of like I've been tentative in the last 10 or maybe 15 fights. Number one, you're fighting the best guys in the world. You got to fill them out. Number two, like, my neck was hurt really bad. I had 2 discs replaced in my neck. And I had that first fight, and it gave me a lot of confidence. So going into UFC 307, I was like, honestly, I don't have anything to lose. I'm on borrowed time. Like, most people don't fight this long anyways. And so I just decided I was going to come out really hard. And I did.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got to his back, and I almost fell off, and I do it's like a neck crank, but it's a short choke from top, and I locked it in and I started squeezing, and I was like, well, I don't know if I'm going to get it. And then I just decided I was going to go all out and go until, it was either done or the round was done. And when he tapped, I just was like, holy cow. Like, yeah, mine went blank, like freaked out. And then after, it was an incredible feeling, like fighting in Utah. I had missed being on the last 2 UFC cards. I'd fought in 2016 in Utah, but man, it was such an incredible experience. And being there in my hometown on a big UFC card and then having such a great performance, like it was definitely a feather in the cap moment. So it was incredible, absolutely incredible. And my family was there. My dad was there. It was my mom and dad's 45th wedding anniversary. So I gave them a shout out. It was really cool.
Yeah, what an inspiring story. So pumped.
Yeah.
I think there's such power in just sharing our story and being open. That's another huge thing that I've been learning from you, just even from the first day that I met you, just be yourself, be open. Like you never know who can benefit from that. And we're given experiences in life, and if we don't share them, what's the point of having them?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you never know who you can inspire. And I mean, sometimes examples too, like I'm not always looking for good examples because sometimes they're good examples of what not to do.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's examples. And I try not to go to extremes. I try to stay in the middle. But whenever I'm present, I try to give my best. And it's good.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh, very last question. What would you say to anyone listening who's going through a difficult time?
Don't give up 5 minutes before the miracle. You never, never know. Don't give up 5 minutes before the miracle.
Hmm.
I mean, there's so many times I look back and I thought, this is it. And I did one more thing. I waited just a little bit longer. I was the last person to leave the gym. I was the last person to leave the meeting. And that's when those miracles happened, when I just didn't give up.
Yeah. And when you're
So,
listening to your intuition, because
oh,
that,
yeah.
and that brought you into those spaces where
Oh, yeah.
God needs you to be, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Court. Again, so honored and very grateful for you and how you show up and you sharing your story and taking the time to just be yourself. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Thank you. I'm gonna be in Utah for January for a few weeks. I
Oh, nice.
forward
It's
to
gonna work out.
yeah.
Yes.
I'll see you
Tuesday
soon.
night, 7:30. It's my favorite striking practice.
All right, Tuesday, 7:30.
7:30.
All right.
All right.
Thanks.
See ya.
Okay, bye.